Shalom. Welcome to Lights of the Nations. Last time that we were together speaking about the temple, we were talking about the delineation really of everything that has to be included in the structure in order for the basic pattern of the temple to be present, according again to that prescription that was given really at Sinai to Moses and passed down. And the Rambam explained that we have a complex really consisting of the outer court, the Heichal, the sanctuary, which really parallels the tent of meeting in the tabernacle, and the sanctuary itself consisting of three parts: the outer hall, the holy, and the Holy of Holies. And now we're going on with Halacha Vav, the sixth entry in the first chapter of Maimonides' laws pertaining to the chosen house, the Beit HaMikdash, the Holy Temple. And here Maimonides begins to explain to us. He says, Ve'osin b'mikdash shiv'a kelim. And there are 7 vessels which are made in the temple, in the Mikdash. And he counts these vessels. And first we'll just read this together. Mizbeach la'olah v'lishar hakarbanot. First we have the altar for the burnt offering and the other offerings. V'kevesh she'olimbo lamizbeach. And the ramp which is used to ascend the altar. U'makomo lifnei ha'ulam mashuch l'darom. And the exact place of the altar is in front of the hall that leads into the sanctuary, and it's drawn a bit towards the south, in the direction of the south. The next vessel that Maimonides lists here is the laver, the wash basin, which is made of copper. V'chiyor v'chano, the laver and its stand, l'kadesh mimenu hakohanim yedehem v'raglehem la'avodah, which is used for the kohanim, the priests, to sanctify their hands and feet before doing the service in the temple. U'mekomo, and the exact placement of the laver is bein ha'ulam v'lamizbeach. It's between the hall and the altar, mashuch lidarom shu smol hanichnas lamikdash, so drawn towards the south, which is going to be at the left of one who is entering into the temple. And then he also mentions umizbeach liktoret, and the altar for the incense, umenorah, and the candelabra, vishulchan, and the table. That is the table of the showbread. Ushloshtan betoch hakodesh lifnei kodesh hakodeshim. And these 3 items are placed inside the holy area of the sanctuary, in front of the Holy of Holies. Now, we have here quite a bit of information, and first of all, I must point out one thing which is really very interesting, because you may be thinking that now that Maimonides has clarified for us that the temple itself consists of such and such a structure, and that it must consist of these compartments, as it were, the Holy and the Holy of Holies, so now he seems to already be telling us about the vessels that are going to be placed inside the temple. That would make sense if that's what we think. After telling us about the temple itself, he is telling us about the vessels inside of the temple. But actually, that is not the case, because there's actually an entire section later on in the writings of the Rambam where he has the laws pertaining to the vessels themselves. And this is called the Hilchot Klei HaMikdash, the laws of the sacred vessels, the service vessels of the temple. But actually, these 7 vessels are not included in that section. He is speaking about them here instead. Let me clarify further that in the Mishnah, it's actually in Tractate Tamid, there is a count of 93 types of vessels which are actually used every day in the Holy Temple. And this is an important concept. These are the vessels which are used in the temple in the everyday service. Now these 7 vessels, which Maimonides is speaking of here, are not included in that number, and thus They do not appear later on in the laws pertaining to the vessels. Why do they appear here in the section which is actually dealing with the structure of the Holy Temple itself? And the answer is because these things are actually, for all practical purpose, part of the temple. In other words, as opposed to the vessels that are used every day by the Kohanim in the service, these vessels are so important, they're so central, that they actually constitute like a part of the house of God itself. They are so imperative that they are actually considered to be like part of the structure of the temple. And thus, of course, they are part of the commandment, and you shall make for me a sanctuary. And that is why Maimonides, in his wisdom, lists these things here and not later on in the section dealing with the temple vessels. So he counts here basically 7 vessels, because he says the altar itself of the offerings and the ramp leading up to the altar. He counts the altar and the ramp as 2 separate entities, and the ramp actually as one of the vessels, as it were, for this count of 7. And, of course, regarding the entire concept of the approach to the altar, why it's necessary for the Kohanim to ascend not on steps, as the verse reminds us in the Torah, if you recall, that there is a specific prohibition against climbing up on steps. So the Kohanim, out of reasons of modesty, so they're not lifting their legs on the steps, they walk up the altar, up the ramp to the altar. And the Rambam describes to us the exact placement of the altar as well. Now, later on in the writings of Maimonides, we're going to be learning a great deal of detail regarding the altar, exactly how the altar is made, the structure of the altar. It's extremely precise, and the exact place of the altar also is so significant as far as the history of really creation and why that is so important. And this is something that we're going to be getting to a bit later. Then Maimonides continued here and told us about the laver. And the laver, we are instructed in the Torah, is a vessel made of copper, and its stand is also considered here, according to Maimonides, to be a separate entity, a separate vessel. And the laver is of paramount importance in the Holy Temple because it is the vessel with which the Kohanim really prepare themselves before doing any of their sacred tasks in the temple. And in a way, when you think about it, this vessel is different than all of the other vessels that are being described and that will be described later. Why? Because the laver is not so much a service vessel, not so much something that is used as part of the divine service, that plays a role in the day-to-day administration or the bringing down of God's blessing into the world on whatever level that the other vessels work, such as the menorah, the light of the menorah, which goes out into the world, the light of the Shekhinah, or the blessing which is represented, the physical blessing which is represented by the loaves of the showbread. These are things we're going to discuss. The laver is used to prepare oneself to be able to administer the service of the temple. So the laver is actually a stage of preparatory, of getting ready to be able to serve in the temple. But that, in that regard, it's really the most important thing of all, because the Kohanim must sanctify, is the expression in the Torah, their hands and feet before doing any of their sacred tasks in the temple. And the placement of the laver as well is described. And let's pause a moment before we speak about the other vessels that Maimonides describes here and reflect for a moment about the significance of the laver, because there is so much that we can learn about this vessel, and really I think about the Torah's attitude towards some very, very central themes in life from that which our sages express to us and give over to us about the history of the laver. Because when God instructed Israel to bring forth the materials as a donation for the establishment of the tabernacle, everyone came and brought forth all of the materials that they had brought out of Egypt, and this was used to build the tabernacle, the gold and the silver and the precious weavings and the colors and the stones, and everything was used for the fulfillment of the particular mitzvot, the commandments that God gave in the instruction of the tabernacle. Now our sages relate to us that when it came time to build the laver, how is this done? The particular scenario that is described is that all of the righteous women of Israel, and by the way, we have a number of teachings that relate to the fact that the women of that particular generation, the generation that came out of Egypt, were exceedingly righteous. They were on a far higher spiritual level than the men. And that's because, I can prove that, because, for example, they did not participate at all in the sin of the golden calf. But before that, when they were still in Egypt, you have to understand what was going on there was that Pharaoh had a very particular agenda. And his agenda was to totally destroy the Jewish people and to totally break them. And part of this plan was to ensure in different ways that the Jewish people would not be reproducing. And so the men were separated from their wives, and they were given slave labor all day long, and they were forced to work under very difficult circumstances. And at the end of the day, they were quite exhausted, returning home. And the women, who are, as I said, on a very high level of spiritual awareness and perception and connection to godliness, really, they realized that they had a very important sacred task, and that is to make sure that the Jewish people will continue and to bring another generation. And they realized that it was up to them to see to it that their husbands would come to them and would be with them, so that children would be born into the world, more Jewish children. And their husbands were so broken by the terrible work that was given to them, but the women used to adorn themselves, make themselves very beautiful, and go out to greet their husbands. And in such manner, they had the merit, really, of bringing forth another generation. And the way that they adorned themselves in preparations for their husbands was by the aid of mirrors, which they had, that were made of highly polished copper. So they made themselves beautiful for their husbands, in short. After the Jewish people left Egypt and they received the commandment of the tabernacle in the desert, the women of Israel came forward to Moses, and they wanted to donate their copper mirrors. And our sages relate to us in the Midrash that the initial reaction of Moshe Rabbeinu, of Moses, was to refuse the offer of the mirrors of the women, because he felt that this is unseemly. He felt that in the tabernacle of God, where everything is, relating to the spiritual, it would not be proper to have a reminder of something physical. It would not be proper to have something that had been used for something physical to go into something to fulfill the commandment of God. And God told Moses that he was totally mistaken. God told Moses, no, this is exactly what I want to use for the laver. And in fact, that donation was accepted. And the copper wash basin and stand was in fact constructed from the copper mirrors of the righteous women of Israel. And this is such an important concept that even though, as we're going to learn later on, there may come a time in history when the congregation of Israel is more wealthy and can afford to make certain vessels out of gold, even though they are not necessarily required to make everything out of gold. If they are able to, they should try to make even other things out of gold, because it's more of an embellishment of the commandment. It's more of a beautification of the honor of God. But the copper wash basin and stand is always to remain out of simple copper as a memorial to those righteous women, because it was so beloved of God that they brought those mirrors. Why is this so? On a very simple level, really. Because their act was coming from such self-sacrifice and such a place of pure and holy dedication to their people and to their families. Their motivation was so totally sincere and so totally pure that God realized this is the stuff of the tabernacle. This is the stuff of self-sacrifice, of really coming closer to God. And moreover, the theme of the tabernacle, the theme of the temple, and really the theme of Jewish existence in this world, which is to try and use everything that God gave us for His purpose, to connect to a sense of divine purpose in life. In other words, to subjugate the physical and to turn it really into something spiritual. So, what better symbol of that than the fact that these women, with that high motivation, wanted to ensure another generation of Jews, and their motivation was not selfish, their motivation was really for the sake of God. Now, obviously, this also teaches us a great deal about Hashem's attitude towards the proper, holy relationship between husband and wife. And this is not necessarily the place to digress into that, but obviously, this shows us something of the holiness of that relationship when it is conducted properly and not in a selfish manner. But think about this even on a deeper level, and you realize how amazing this whole teaching is. Because, again, the initial reaction of Moses was, oh, this is not proper. And God said, no, you're very much mistaken. This is exactly what I want for the laver, to remember the motivation of those righteous women. But think about this also, even on a deeper level. Not only is the copper laver the first vessel which is encountered every day, and the vessel which is necessary in order for the Kohanim, who are, after all, the emissaries of God, who are, through their actions in the temple, bringing down the divine influx of blessing into the world. Moses was so mistaken, God said to him, because not only is what they did a wonderful thing, and not only did God appreciate exactly what their motivation was, but that very tool became the device through which all is prepared for the service in the temple, and through which the Kohanim actually purify their very physicality through the water of the laver. In other words, to bring themselves to the level of purity where they can officiate in the temple. They sanctify their hands and feet. In other words, they cleanse themselves of misconception, of all of the previous notions that they may have about life, and they start every day fresh off. And this, by the way, is one of the ways of looking at the commandment of the Kohanim sanctifying their hands and feet every day at dawn. It's that basically the Kohen comes into the Beit HaMikdash, into the Holy Temple, and he comes to wash himself in this water, and he says, you know what, everything that I thought I knew about God, I don't know. And I'm starting all over again. And I am cleansing myself of every preconceived notion that I have, and I'm starting all over again in my relationship of coming closer to God and being an instrument for Him. So the Kohanim are bringing sanctity to themselves and into the world through the very vessel that one might think, if one was mistaken and was looking at things the way a lot of people are used to looking at things, one might think, oh, this is not something godly. No, this too, this area of human endeavor, the holy relationship, when done, when conducted with sanctity and with fear of heaven between husband and wife, is in itself a tool of godliness that brings blessing into the world. And this is one of the levels of understanding of the copper wash basin and stand. And then Maimonides goes on and tells us that the incense altar and the menorah and the table of the showbread, these three items are to be found inside the holy area of the sanctuary in front of the Holy of Holies. And again, later on, we're going to be discussing the precise nature of these vessels. We're going to be discussing the precise nature of the altar, the placement of the altar, how the altar is constructed, of what type of stones, how it has to be built. We're going to be discussing the exact nature of the construction of the laver and the altar of the incense and the menorah and the table. And at the moment, I think the main thing here that the teaching of Maimonides is to impart to us is, again, that these items are so basic that they are really not like the other 93 vessels that we find in the Mishnah, in Masechet Tamid, in Tractate Tamid. But these vessels are actually a major part of the temple structure itself, so that they actually are considered like the building, and that is why you will find them here in this particular section of Maimonides, Hilchot Beit HaBechira, the laws of the temple itself, and not later on in the laws of the vessels, because they are in fact such a major part of the temple itself. So, and again, regarding the water of the laver, every Kohen, every priest is obligated to sanctify, is the expression of the Torah, his hands and feet before doing any of his service in the temple. And without this, that Kohen, his service is actually invalid. So this is a very, very important concept indeed. Now we're going on to the seventh halacha in this section, where Maimonides tells us that the menorah is placed on the southern part, in the southern area, as it were, of the sanctuary itself, which would be at the left of one who enters, whereas the table is at the right, the table of the showbread. So these two items, the menorah and the table of the showbread, are actually, he continues and tells us, at the end of the sacred area, at the end of the Kodesh. They are right outside the Holy of Holies. And the menorah is towards the south, and the table towards the right. Whereas the golden incense altar is really in the middle, and as you can see here, placed somewhat between them. And in Halacha Zayin, Maimonides continues and tells us that inside the court there are boundaries that are established, and these boundaries signify that until this certain point, Israelites may venture, but only until a certain point, and from that point only Kohanim can venture, and then from another point only, Kohanim also cannot venture. In other words, there are lines of demarcation within the temple itself. In fact, in one of the tractates of the Talmud, in Masechet Kelim, there is a teaching that there are really 10 levels of sanctity, 10 distinct ascending levels of sanctity in the land of Israel, and 8 of these levels are actually within the Temple Mount. And these are basically lines of demarcation as far as who may enter to what points and when. And we're going to be learning more about this also as we continue. And Maimonides concludes in Halacha Zayin that there are various chambers that are also built within the temple for various needs. And each one of these, he calls them batim, actually. He says, Ubonimba batim l'shar tzarchei hamikdash. There are small buildings that are really built within the temple for various needs. And every one of these buildings is referred to as a lishka, as a chamber. And here, at this particular point, Maimonides does not enumerate exactly what these chambers are, but we are going to be studying about this also, the very complex system of chambers within the temple. So, to recap, what we've learned here is actually quite important, because Maimonides is teaching us that these items listed in Halacha Vav, the altar and its ramp, the laver and its stand, as well as the incense altar and the menorah and the table of the showbread, are all so important that they really form a part and parcel of the temple itself, not to be confused with the other vessels that are used for the temple service. These vessels are really significant of the whole nature of the temple, and that's why this is listed here. And as we continue, we're going to be learning about the great detail of every single one of these vessels, what has to go into it in order for it to be considered proper for the temple, and in order to bring about the spiritual rectification that is within its power to do so, to bring about the resting of the divine presence amongst all of humanity, the Shekhinah, the light of the whole world, the light to Israel, and the light to the nations.